Hello, everyone, and welcome to KNative 101. I'm Matt Moore. I'm one of the founders of KNative. I lead the serving area of the project, and I sit on the technical oversight committee. Before we get started, I want to thank Evan Anderson for giving a really fantastic, similar, longer presentation on this that I borrowed a lot of slides from. Before we get started, let's talk a little bit about the goals of KNative. We wanted to achieve a serverless style user experience that lived on top of Kubernetes. And when we were starting to think about what we needed in order to do this, we identified three main areas where there were gaps that we needed to fill in order to devise a solution. One of those areas was taking your source code and turning it into a container, which we called build. One of those areas was being able to scale your container-based workload based on requests. We called this serving. And the final area was how we brought events into the system and how we reasoned about events. And we called this area eventing. We wanted these to stand on their own, but also to be highly complementary so that folks could build serverless solutions on top of these components and Kubernetes. And as a sort of testament to our success here, we eventually spun build out as the seed for what would become the Tecton project, a very successful open source community in its own right. So when folks talk about KNative today, they're typically talking about these serving and eventing pieces. Serving has two main areas of investment within that umbrella: autoscaling, which handles the request-based scaling, and networking, where we handle integration with various ingress layers like those listed here. Got a half a dozen or so these days. On the eventing side, there are sort of two areas of focus as well. There's bringing events into the system from literally anything that could emit an event could have a source associated with it. And then there's how we model and deliver those events within our eventing model. And we have integrations and implementations of those abstractions that sit on top of, a whole bunch of different messaging systems like NATS and Kafka and Rabbit, as well as cloud vendor ones like GCP PubSub. So today we are going to focus in on serving because that really is, I think, one of the areas of the project that aligns most with Cloud Foundry, and this is CF Summit. So to drill in here, let's talk about the anatomy of a service. A service resource is sort of the one resource to rule them all in KNative serving. And so let's talk about the resource model a little bit, sort of broken down from there. So the service is a simplified API over two other resources within our model that you can use directly, but hopefully you don't need to, the route and the configuration. So the configuration is effectively a description of how to run what. And the route is effectively what makes different versions of that accessible. And so you can see this, a simple example of a service on the bottom left here in YAML, because that's what folks do with Kubernetes, right? They throw YAML at it. So if you were to apply this, you would get typically two URLs, one that's available external to the cluster and one that's available within the cluster. And so we followed the Kubernetes style here in constructing these URLs. And the first part of the host name is based on the name of the resource. And the second part of the host name is based on the namespace. So since it's CF Summit, I was encouraged, and you all love your CLI, I was encouraged to also show that you can do the same thing without the YAML, right, through the CLI. So can service create, you specify the namespace and the name and the image, and you can create the same service. So let's drill in a little bit deeper into first configuration, right? I described this as how to run what. And so the configuration effectively tracks how you want to run your software, and as you update it, it stamps out revisions, which are basically point in time snapshots of that description. And so you can think of it a lot like the head of a branch in your favorite version control system, whereas the revisions are like commits. If we're talking Git, they're immutable. They represent sort of how to run what at a particular point in time, and configuration is really the collection of those, tracking the latest one. Now, the route, I described the route as controlling which versions are accessible. So now that we have these revisions in this configuration, the route can point at particular revisions to give you very fine control over which versions of that application are accessible to your users. Now you can point to a single specific revision if you wanted to, be very controlled about which versions get rolled out, or you can point to a specific version to roll back to a previous last known good if you have some sort of issue. You can traffic split across these, or you can just point the revision at the configuration if you just wanted to constantly roll out the latest ready revision as the configuration gets updated. And this is the default mode that we use with our service. So now that we've talked about the resource model a little bit, let's talk about the data path and what happens there. So one of the goals with KNative was when you have the system and you're putting it under near constant load, the overhead of KNative is as little as possible. And so we've put a lot of elements on this slide that you typically have. The one thing you wouldn't have if you weren't using KNative is our queue proxy sidecar. And hopefully you'll see in the coming slides why that's interesting and important. So one of the use cases of this queue proxy is to support the idea of bounded concurrency. So in typical fast systems like Lambdas, your Google Cloud Functions and whatnot, there's this idea that only a single request is let through to your function, to each instance of your function at a time. And so this has some really nice properties. You don't have to worry as much about locking global state within your process, and it allows you to reason about the amount of resources that each instance of your function has available to it to process each request. Now, the queue proxy sits on the data path to effectively make sure that only a single request, or if you make it concurrency 3, it makes sure that the appropriate number of requests are being allowed through to the user container at a given time. So this allows folks to build your typical fast models on top of KNative. So with that queue proxy in there, it also enables us to scale the number of container replicas based on the request rate. So without needing to have deeper visibility into what the HTTP layer is doing in front of us, or requiring the user to do crazy things in the user container to expose metrics, by having that queue proxy there, it gives us a consistent place that's available on the data path all the time to surface metrics, and we can make scaling decisions based on it. So for instance, if we see a traffic increase, right, we can spin up additional capacity to respond to that. One of the interesting things when you're scaling based on requests, though, is the idea of scaling to 0, right? When we see that the request rate has dropped to, not receiving any requests, we are able to wire in our activator component and tear down the final remaining pod so that at rest, when you're not receiving any traffic, there's effectively no cost. But one of the most important things when you're scaling to 0 is being able to scale from 0. So if that activator receives a request, it is able to bring a pod online just in time and forward the request to that pod once it's come up and it's ready. So let's pivot a little bit and talk about some of the features of the HTTP routing layer. So we mentioned the ability to do percentage-based splits. This is actually something that you can't do in terms of just raw Kubernetes resources without targeting a specific ingress layer, because the Kubernetes ingress doesn't support percentage-based splits. And so you can do this directly with Istio or Contour, one of the ingress layers, but there isn't a standard way of doing this. We thought that this was fundamentally important to rolling out software because, reasoning in terms of percentages is just what we want to do. Whereas with Kubernetes, with raw Kubernetes, it's very coarse and it's, you can get 90-10, but only if you have 100 pods basically kicking around, and then, yeah. So, so we wanted to support the idea of percentage-based splits. Now, one of the other things that we do in our HTTP layer is we program it so that as you're doing these rollouts, you can also directly target one of those splits. So if, for instance, you're starting to do a canary rollout where 99% of your traffic is still going to your previous version, but you want to start to qualify your new 1% canary with very focused testing that hits that all the time, we have this idea of tags where you can tag a particular split and target that directly with some of your load. So if you wanted to probe it directly or run tests against it or whatnot, as you're rolling it out and starting to qualify it, you can do that with tags. Okay, so let's shift away from the features of the control plane and the data plane and serving, and talk a little bit about what's coming for both Knative serving, but Knative in general. So feature number one is all around reliability, stability, scalability, performance. This is our feature number one. We want to make sure that we are not regressing on any of these dimensions, and frankly, improving these is pretty fundamental to moving the project forward. This means bigger clusters, running more instances, serving higher traffic, and more testing of these different scenarios. This means smaller clusters, think edge, right? Which means running in a smaller footprint, and we want to constantly drive latency down and reduce our release toil. In addition to our feature number one, we also have a whole bunch of additional functionality that's coming. One of these is vanity domain. So instead of being restricted to just name.namespace.suffix, right, being able to put a very specific domain on your services. So you serve your blog off of www.mattmoore.io. It's a much nicer thing for folks to remember and type. More sophisticated request dispatching. So, being able to dispatch, do more than, percentage-based splits and stuff like that. Request affinity, being able to dispatch on things like method or path. These are all things that we've seen requests for. We have a group of folks that are investigating whether we can find common ground for a functions experience on top of Knative, which ties together a whole bunch of different things. And I think we're all sort of hoping to find some nice common ground there so that we can have a common multi-cloud, multi-vendor function experience that we can get behind. Discovery is basically a mechanism that we're looking into for finding out what event types and event schemas are within the system. This pairs really nicely with things like the functions experience. Because if I wanted to scaffold a new function, I can look at what event types are available within the system, get their schemas, and sort of bootstrap a new function signature from that. It's sort of like IDE-like functionality, which is super cool. And then the last area is another interesting thing we're looking at in eventing, which is the dual of sources, which is sinks, right? So where sources are sort of events coming into the system, sinks are about sort of emitting events from our eventing model and sending them out to external messaging systems. So the last area is about sort of aligning with the broader ecosystem and sustainability of how we invest in the project. So one of the key areas here where we have been investing and will continue to invest is around open governance. So a couple months ago, we had our first DOC elections, and we now have a nice multi-vendor, diverse technical oversight committee. We just merged a PR describing how we will do a similar style thing for our steering committee. And those elections are going to be coming up very soon. With alignment, so there are a whole bunch of efforts that we, as a broader project, are aligning with. Cloud events is a really big one that a lot of the folks from the eventing side of our community are deeply involved in. Ingress v2 is one of those things where bringing some of those more sophisticated capabilities that weren't in Ingress v1 that we wanted into the Ingress v2 definition. That's one of the things that we're collaborating on. And then things like endpoint slices, which Kubernetes is built up as a way of achieving higher scale, right? This is one of those efforts we want to align with in order to support, running on bigger clusters, more traffic, more resources. We want to get some of the best practices we've developed out there. So things like our duck typing of Kubernetes resources and the way we handle conditions. Duck typing is actually a great example because it is one of the things that the service binding folks, the Kubernetes service binding folks, are starting to look at as a mechanism for binding information into Kubernetes-based workloads, including Knative services. And I wanted to make a point to highlight that because CF Summit, right? It's one of the really cool things, in my opinion, about Cloud Foundry is this idea of service bindings, and bringing that to Kubernetes and being able to do that through some of the best practices that we've been working on in KNative, is really cool to me. And especially, bringing that to folks, making sure that we are well aligned with that, and so that folks can access that service binding effort within the context of Knative serving is also really interesting. So with that, I'm going to put up the list of resources, and I think we're going to switch over to questions. Bernd, what are your thoughts on using Knative components as part of Cloud Foundry on Kubernetes? Good question. I mean, I will admit that I am not deeply familiar with sort of the inner workings of Cloud Foundry, but I know there's interesting overlaps, and I think I'm supportive of sort of exploring that direction and supporting it. But honestly, I think I defer to, there's a lot of folks actually within the Knative community that have a lot more sort of background in CF than I do, like Dr. Jules, and frankly, a lot of the folks from IBM, I think, come from sort of a Cloud Foundry background. So I think, it's an interesting direction to talk about, but I think I'd defer to those experts on sort of some of the things we'd need to do in terms of mechanics and whatnot. But generally, I'm supportive, and I think I'd be interested in knowing sort of how we'd have to change Knative to be to support that. Right. I mean, ultimately, we want the pieces of Knative to support use cases like, that, not just sort of your fast things, but we see folks building all kinds of sort of higher level developer facing experiences on top of Kubernetes using Knative. Fast is probably one of the most common, but I don't know. Does that sort of answer your question? I don't know that I can speak to the specifics of what that might look like, given yeah. I feel like I'm talking to myself though. Does anyone else have any other questions? Bernd, does that answer your question, or do you have a more specific question I can dance around or try and answer? And okay, cool. I was looking for your answer in the Q&A panel. Still learning this UI. You can see the sun rising out my window if there are no questions. It's pretty early here. Oh, I see another Q&A question. Any plans, ideas on how rules for request dispatching would look like? I assume that's talking about the sort of path method-based dispatching that I mentioned in the discussion. or in the presentation. I would say it's pretty early. I can give my opinions on it, but we don't have anything that's an approved design for it or anything like that. I've prototyped a little bit here. Let's see. So generally, I think what we want to do with, for instance, domain mapping, and I bring that up because that's further along, and I think there's elements of it that are interesting. I think we want to achieve those kinds of things through composition so that they work with Knative services, but they also work with other things that we might build, like something that does more sophisticated request dispatching. And so I think the way I'm looking at the sort of idea around request dispatching is as something where you would sort of specify matching rules that would program the L7 layer to do various matching and dispatching that could compose with Knative services or Knative routes, in addition to potentially other things like the Knative channel and broker on the eventing side. So if you wanted certain routes to go over there, you could do that. And then ultimately, part of the goal is to be able to sort of stitch together a bunch of, functions and other things into something like an API surface or something like that. That's sort of the rough sketch, but my preference would be to achieve some of these things through composition so that they can compose with other things we haven't thought of yet, or other things that may exist sort of outside of the sort of main upstream of Knative, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question? All right. So I don't know. Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of fun. I've played with a similar concept for a while, and wanted to. It's something I've wanted to do for a while, but there's some aspects of our networking layer that have taken some time to reach the point where I think we've sort of figured out composition, and I think we did that as part of the domain mapping stuff. So. So yeah, so I'm hoping that we'll make some progress on that in the coming months. So I'm happy to keep chatting. I don't know how time works for this, but I don't think I have anything for another 20-25 minutes or so. So if folks have other questions, I'm happy to hang out and answer them. And I'm basically always reachable on Knative Slack. I sit on a lot of Slack workspaces these days. Usually Matt Moore, no E on whatever Slack workspace. You can see if I'm there. If folks have questions after the session. All right. All right. Nobody else has any more questions. I think I'm going to hit the big red stop broadcast button. We'll give it another minute. see any more questions popping up. So thanks everyone for coming and asking questions. Hopefully it was useful. And again, feel free to hit me up on Slack. My email's the same, mattmoore@VMware. If folks need an invite to a Slack workspace where we can chat or want to reach out over email. But thanks for coming.